Hello and welcome to the Whitehall Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Westminster. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello. And also on the podcast, Kirsty Buchanan, who was a special advisor to the Prime Minister, Theresa May. Hello, Kirsty.
Hello, Calum.
And Jo Tanner is usually here, the political strategist, but she's on a little bit of a jaunt at the moment. But we will still hear from her in just a sec. So
She's
don't
gone
worry about
full
that.
on Judith Chalmers. Where is she?
She's fled the country to Nice. She saw the budget and she thought, sack this, I'm out of here.
She's one of those. The figures came out, didn't they, about emigration is the highest on record.
That's right.
Straight after the budget. I thought the two things were quite ironic.
Yeah, our latest billionaire to leave the country is Jo Tanner. But we'll get a voice note from her in just a sec with her sort of budget thoughts, and that is where our episode is focusing today, of course, is on the budget. We're 2 days after it. We're recording on Friday the 28th of November, and I hope that you enjoyed listening to our Behind the Scenes on Budget Day episode that we published on Wednesday as to how these days actually work in practice for those who are working during them. I was actually in the House of Commons on this Wednesday past, Kirsty, for the budget, and I sat in for Scotland questions, which come before Prime Minister's questions. I sat in for that as well, and then for the budget itself. And just as Scotland questions was concluding was when the OBR report was accidentally retrieved from their website. It was published early, or it was accessed early, whatever the investigation will ultimately find. In any case, it was there, the entirety of the budget. And I was texting one of the people on the Conservative front bench who I could see, and I messaged and I said, have you seen that the OBR report is out? And he said, we have all just had our message. We're all now, and I looked up and all of the Conservatives had their phones out and their iPads out and they were scrolling frantically and writing notes and passing notes to one another. They got a sort of 30, 40, in fact, they got an hour and a half's head start on responding to the Chancellor's budget because they had it in their hands early, even before Prime Minister's questions. It was astonishing.
Absolutely extraordinary and completely unprecedented. Look, my guess is it's probably just a very bad mistake by the OBR, but it's so symbolic of the sense of chaos that has preceded this budget by weeks and weeks and weeks and frozen everybody in a sort of state of fear, and consumers aren't spending and the house market isn't moving and businesses aren't investing because we've had this great big kind of chaotic roll up to the budget where things are. And the thing that made me laugh the most about the OBR, even though it came out early, it's not like it came out and it was full of great revelations, because so much of this budget had been leaked and briefed by Treasury officials, and kites had been flown left, right and centre, and pictures had been rolled and then rolled back up again, etc. You name it, it's been out there. And so actually, whilst it was very symbolic of the kind of chaotic run-up to the budget, in essence, both the OBR book and her actual speech, we all kept on waiting for some kind of surprise, some rabbit out of the hat. We're like, no, we know all this because we've read about it in the papers for weeks and weeks and weeks.
Yeah.
Extraordinary. If nothing else, I hope that this resets a belief in a much more Purdah-like budget. It has been extremely damaging for growth, extremely damaging for the market, for the housing market, for business investment, for consumer confidence. And, you just look. There's never Purdah for budgets. Isn't exactly honoured in the breach. It's always been honoured in the breach rather than the observance. But this has been of a whole different level here. This is just ridiculous, and it's got to stop.
And so our assessment of the budget was probably formed about a week ago. But anyway, we had it actually delivered on Wednesday. So how would you describe it, Kirsty? There's talk about this was a classic Labour budget. It raised tax, it raised spending on things like welfare. Is this a classic Labour budget? And should we call it high tax, high spend? What are the metrics for that?
Yes and yes and yes is the short answer to all of those. Yes, it's a return to kind of classic Labour budget. Yes, it's high on spend. It's higher on borrowing as well, by the way, than people have kind of cottoned on to. And it's high on taxes. In fact, the highest tax burden now in modern history. Look, we said in our brilliant live podcast preview of the budget that there are three different types of budgets. There are ones that are big reforming budgets. There are those that build on an existing narrative for a government, which this government couldn't do because it still doesn't have an existing narrative to speak of. And then those are straightforward kind of political survival budgets. And I think politically, there are two things that are interesting about this. One, and we can talk about this in a minute, that it is a return to kind of classic Labour tax and spend. But two, what it does in terms of Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. This was about fundamentally living to fight another day. And on that, Rachel Reeves needed to get my teeth in, two different things. One, make sure that there was no adverse and significant reaction from the markets, which she did by building up that fiscal headroom that we hear so much about. So it kind of acts as a sort of national buffer zone, if you like.
Yeah,
in
so the rainy day account. Yeah,
economic shocks. And she's built that up from 9.9 billion, which is where it was in the budget last year. And everyone said that is way too low. And almost as soon as she had sat down, at least 5 billion of it had been eaten up by various different slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And the other was to calm this increasing noise from the backbenches about replacing Starmer. Now, everybody knows that, a chancellor and a prime minister are key to each other's survival. So we ended up with a budget that did what it needed to do politically for the Chancellor and for the Prime Minister, is allowed them to live to fight another day. The markets didn't overreact. The backbenchers were very happy with the lifting of the 2-child cap on benefits, which, up until relatively recently, Rachel Reeves was vehemently opposed to on economic grounds. And so she's done that. But the price of doing that, apart from the facile price of doing that, which is £26 billion of tax raises, is that she's ended up with the perception that she has clobbered working people, A, to save her own skin, and B, to appease a backbench, even though this should be quite a strong government. It's got a working majority of 169. And that working people who will now face the highest tax burden in modern memory are going to be paying for a ballooning welfare bill.
Yeah.
So what she's done is appease two elements of her audiences, which has given her a short-term kind of survival, but actually opened up a whole new battlefront against kind of Middle England, alarm clock Britain, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. And on that note, a couple of things we want to consider on the pod today, one of which we'll do in a moment with Simon French, the chief economist and head of research at Panmure Liberum, is on business rates and how much more places like pubs, etc., are going to have to pay on business rates because of various tweaks within the system, the long and short of which is lots of these sorts of hospitality businesses look like they're going to have to pay potentially tens of thousands of pounds more in rate. The other part of this, Kirsty, and here we are on the Friday after the Wednesday, so we've had more time to analyse, we've had more time to digest. The other part of the concern about what this budget has done is in education and in the provision of special educational needs and disabilities support within schools in England. And the reporting today is that actually, because of the way the government is going to pull back in, it's going to send educational needs back into central government, that actually there's going to be a £6 billion deficit in that provision that the government is going to need to work extremely hard at, plugging that gap, filling that gap. I spoke to Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, on Times Radio this morning to try to work out how exactly they're going to do that. I don't wish to over-analyse, but she didn't really answer, and it strikes me that they don't really know. And so we're not quite sure how they're going to plug a £6 billion gap in education. She says it won't come from the education budget and from the kind of frontline schools budget, but we're not sure where it'll come from.
To coin a Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the opposition, phrase, I listened to your brilliant interview this morning, and it was loads of little mini waffle bombs from her, wasn't it? It was quite frustrating to listen to. No, and I texted you, didn't I, shortly after the budget to say unexploded bomb here.
You were the first person, 7 o'clock the next morning.
And one of the reasons that this matters hugely, again, on top of this perception of taking on Middle England, and leaving them in a much more difficult position in terms of tax to pay for a welfare bill that they can't or won't get to grips with. There is nothing quite as dangerous as taking on parents in terms of perceived cuts in education. And the only clarity that Bridget Phillipson said this morning was that this £6 billion bill won't be borne by core school budgets. Now, I'd like to probably drill down into what exactly core schools budgets means and whether it will just be drawn from the Department for Education budget. She seemed to indicate it would be coming right across Whitehall and budgets right across government, in which case you rightly said, well, which other department is going to have to take a financial hit for £6 billion? This is not chump change here.
Yes.
And actually, that doesn't answer the fundamental question as well, which is also in the OBR figures. If that is the case, then why is the OBR said that will result in a reduction in per pupil funding from of 4.9%? So somewhere, to coin a youth phrase, the maths is not mathing here for me. It's either going across all budgets or it's coming from the Department for Education. And if that is the case, which seems to be indicated by the OBR, unless the OBR has got its facts wrong, why is it having an impact on the per pupil funding? So that's one thing. Secondary, even if it is spread across, and I'm not entirely sure that is true, or whether that's a live battle between the DfE and the Treasury right now playing out on the media round, even if that is true, there's still going to be a quite consequential hit on the Department for Education's budget, which means that somewhere someone is going to have to suffer. Now, if you've got parents in mainstream education who are already kind of feeling, schools are feeling the squeeze, you're not going to want to have your child's education and per pupil funding impacted by what is effectively an accounting move, which is moving the cost of something off local authority back into government. And if you are a parent of a child with special educational needs, and I'll declare an interest here, as am I, and my son has an EHCP, there has been a lot of concern that some of this is going to come as a result of squeezing educational funding for SEN children and potentially removing their legal rights that they're enshrined in these educational healthcare plans. It's also possibly going to come at a move, no matter how much you dress it up, of pushing special educational needs back into mainstream education because it's cheaper. That's the reality of it. Now, I'm here to tell you, having learnt a long and painful battle about this, not every child with special educational needs can or will be accommodated by mainstream education. And what I don't want to see is a government trying to dress this up as what's good for children when in reality it's just about saving money. Plenty of parents go through the fight of getting their child into the educational environment that they need to be in, which tends to be special education, because mainstream education cannot provide the right school environment for them. Yeah. So that's a battle that's going to really open up in the new year. The other kind of ongoing battle of all of this is around welfare. We saw obviously in the summer the government's attempts to save a relatively modest amount of money from the ballooning welfare bill end in utter humiliation and a backbench forced U-turn on the government. So we now have, on top of tax raises, the perception that some of that is to meet the fact that Labour can't get control of welfare spending. We had some woolly pledges in the budget about future reforms of welfare budget. But at the moment, again in the OBR, it's scored to go up £73 billion by the end of this decade. £73 billion. To put that in context, that increase alone is more than our entire defence budget. This is something we've got to get to grips with. Now, whether we, rip the plaster on the triple lock or the government tries to have another go at reining in its own backbenchers on welfare, something has got to give on this. It is simply utterly unsustainable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge amount of money. It's a huge amount of money. I just want to jump in at this point and let you hear from the south of France, from our esteemed billionaire colleague. As far as I'm aware, Joe is not actually a billionaire, by the way. I should probably just say that.
It's only a multimillionaire.
That's fine. Let's have a little listen. Here is a voice note, a postcard, if you will, from Joe Tanner.
So I think what's really interesting about the budget is the choice that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have clearly made around the politics that they need to deal with. And I think it's a sign really of where this government have sort of got to in such a short amount of time, that they have prioritised the politics and their own side and appeasing their own side over what were potentially sort of more difficult issues that they had to deal with. And I think the interesting thing is that they've still, however, managed to cause themselves significant problems for their own side, when their own side will be knocking on doors, because the principle of raising taxes for working people has clearly been broken with what they've done. It doesn't matter how you dress it up. There are going to be fundamental problems that MPs will face when they go and knock on doors. And I think, building upon previous budgets, it's a pretty unhelpful narrative. And I think it's a narrative that has the potential to stick.
Let's welcome then to the Whitehall Sources podcast Simon French, Chief Economist and Head of Research at Panmure Liberum, who's also worked at the Treasury, the DWP and the Cabinet Office, presumably before seeing the errors of his ways. Hello, Simon.
Good morning, Calum.
It's so good to have you. Right, so we're a couple of days post-budget. I wonder what your sort of big picture analysis is on what we have witnessed this week, on what this budget has done and perhaps what it hasn't done.
Well, so from an economic standpoint, I think amidst all the noise, and it's largely been negative noise, I think there are some encouraging signs. And I think from the business community, a couple of things stood out for me on the day of the budget. First of all, the Chancellor moving to one single forecast, or at least one single binding forecast for her fiscal rules, or the assessment against his fiscal rules, a year. And I think we can all agree over the last couple of months, this has been a bit of a circus that has had a damaging blowback on sentiment, on investment, on consumer spending. And so if we reduce the frequency of that down to once a year, that feels encouraging. The other aspect of that is doubling the headroom to an estimated £22 billion, having had just under £10 billion in the last two fiscal events. I think that provides something of a window for some of the pent-up demand that probably has emerged as a result of the last few months to flow into the economy, not flood into the economy, but maybe more sort of drip in the first half of next year, which should be encouraging.
What would you say is your assessment of who has benefited in this budget, whether it is workers, whether it is those on welfare, who has kind of come out of this in a better position?
Well, look, I certainly think that the first order impact was, as the media have largely described it, as a transfer of economic value, economic rents from people in work to people not exclusively outside of work, but certainly those who are getting transfer payments from the government. Because, of course, a lot of the people who are getting, if you think of the two-child benefit cap, the abolition as the big impact, it's not exclusively those people out of work. There are plenty of people in that cohort who are in work. But certainly that is the narrative. I think that is right. But as always, I mean, it's probably four-dimensional political chess, some of these decisions. And if the prize, if you like, for the private sector, for economic growth, is a bit more stability as a result of effectively buying off your backbenchers, if you're the Chancellor, let's be crude about this, through abolition of the two-child benefit cap. If that provides a degree of political stability, the private sector is a beneficiary of all of that. So let's not look at it solely through as a single sort of transfer, because actually it has a potentially positive spillover into sentiment.
I should ask as well about the markets, the notorious, infamous markets and market reaction, which, from my sort of slightly ignorant position, seems to have been fairly all right, actually, which suggests there's a kind of a relative level of economic warmth from the markets. Is that fair?
Not ignorant at all, Calum. I think you're absolutely spot on. I think if you had offered the Chancellor on Wednesday morning the opportunity to see gilt yields lower across the curve by the end of the day and sterling stronger, she would have bitten your arm off. Not literally, obviously. I think the advantage that the market response has had is it provides, if you like, less of an acute pressure for U-turns. Calms down the sort of sense of financial market sort of chaos that has been associated with fiscal events of recent vintage. I think the most encouraging aspect of all of this was the near-term inflationary picture. I think if we look back at the budget of 2024, the history of that period was inflation as a result of employer national insurance being passed through to consumer prices. She didn't make that same mistake. Indeed, the OBR assumed that the budget measures take about 0.4% off inflation next year versus what it would have been without those measures. And that starts to surprise in the idea that the Bank of England can do not just a rate cut next month in December, but also perhaps follow it up with a rate cut or two in the first half of next year. And for householders, people with debt sort of looking for lower interest rate costs, that can be encouraging.
Can we look at this issue of rateable values particularly in the hospitality sector? It seems to be one of the stings in the budget. There was a suggestion that lots of people's business rates were going to go down, but actually we're beginning to hear a lot of pubs and restaurants saying that their business rates are going to absolutely jump next year. Can you explain what's going on there?
Well, the recalculation of that, it feels like one of those events that we didn't all pick up on the day, but seems to have unravelled as we've gone through the detail. Now, there was a lot of speculation going into it of a shift of burden from smaller businesses, from hospitality towards the big warehouses, the sort of a pivot from, let's say, the pub to the Amazon warehouse. Doesn't appear like that is the case. Now, I will have to confess, I am not a business rate expert. I have a team outside who sort of see this in an aggregate actually as quite a positive move. But I think, as always, in something quite as complex as business rates, and you can extend this probably to whether the government wants to go down this route on council tax in terms of revaluation and re-rating on property tax, it is fiendishly difficult to do without some pretty perverse outcomes. And of course, the people who lose creating rather more noise than the people who are a beneficiary.
Yeah. Kirsty, I want to actually just put to you the polling from this morning on all of this as well from YouGov, laying out really the scale of the task, I think, for the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. 48%, according to YouGov, see the budget as unfair. 21% see it as fair. Guess which is the only budget that scored worse? That's right, it was Liz Truss. Well done, everyone who said Liz Truss. 50% of people say it will leave their family worse off. Only 3% say they'll be better off. A clear majority of people opposing the tax rise on workers and lifting the two-child benefit cap. I mean, it's something of an indictment from the public as to what this budget has actually done or not done this week.
Well, I mean, I just want to answer your question by asking Simon another question, if I may, for now. Look, I mean, politically, it would have been difficult to the point of being unviable for Rachel Reeves to have broken that key manifesto pledge and raised income tax rates. And instead, she's gone for a 3-year freeze on thresholds, which means that as inflation and wages rise, people will find themselves dragged into a higher band of income tax and national insurance payments. Now, Rachel Reeves last year said that she wouldn't do this because it was picking the pockets of working people. Now, Simon, perversely, whilst politically raising income tax across the board would have been politically harder for her to achieve, in essence, this would have been fairer. This is more aggressive, if you like, because more people will be dragged into paying on the basic rate and into higher rates than those that will be in that additional top rate. Is that right?
I think that's right. And I think you allude to the sort of growth aspects potentially of all of this, which is one of the things that Treasury officials are always looking for is the impact that any tax measure has on work incentives, the sort of the famed supply side response. And I do agree with you that you almost certainly get a better labour market response from, as was widely speculated, a 2p increase, but actually maintaining the threshold levels in terms of keeping in pace with or at least starting to catch up with the pace of inflation, than the model that was chosen. But look, I think we're all pretty clear, aren't we, that the politics, the sort of botched attack on West Streeting, sort of rather kibosh that as a policy option, reduce the political capital I think the Prime Minister actually rather than the Chancellor had, and wouldn't sanction that move.
But politically, then, what she has done, in essence, is, and we can talk later on about kind of welfare and the lifting of the two-child benefit cap. But actually what she's done is walk a tightrope between doing enough to keep the markets on side and doing enough to keep her own backbenchers on side. But actually what she's opened up here is a new battleground effectively against Middle England. And we're not talking about, high-paying people here. We're talking about the people that will be hit most on marginal tax rates here in this fiscal drag are teachers and nurses and, lots of kind of public sector middle income Britain. It was that, politically, it might be a slower burn, but it's still going to be painful.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the budget described as sort of targeting the sort of double Bs of the bond market and benefit recipients, and missing out
and
on
backbenchers as well.
Quadruple
Bs.
The triple Bs, yeah. So sort of the busy Bs of this budget. So what you have, I think, is absolutely right. You've satisfied at least initially those two constituencies, but of course there is a much larger rump of the electorate who Calum's data on how this is polling indicates that there is large disquiet with that of sort of dealing with the cost of living squeeze. I mean, my big frustration, for what it is worth, with this budget was, as I wrote actually in the Times on the day after, it's a sticking plaster on what is the sort of weeping sore of the UK economy, which has got an inflationary problem. UK inflation has risen at an average of 3% over the last 15 years. Reminder, the Bank of England target is 2%. Now, while we'd like to pile on the Bank of England and the former Prime Minister, we've already mentioned her in this podcast, Liz Truss, likes to do that, I don't think they're entirely to blame. In fact, I don't think they're largely to blame for that. I think actually, if you look at the stance of monetary policy, it's been pretty much in kilter with or pretty much in line with most other major economies. But we have gone on two spectacularly disastrous policy missions over the last decade. One is on energy costs, where we've moved from having energy costs in line with the United States to now being 4 times the level of the United States. That is destroying spending power, that is destroying economic growth. We've also moved from having a national living wage or a national minimum wage, as was in 2015, which was 48% of median earnings, to now 66% of median earnings. No other OECD economy has gone on anything like that journey. And you are now starting to see both the ratchet that has having in terms of the cost of labour all the way up the income distribution, but it's also pricing out jobs we've already mentioned, actually, in the context of business rates, in hospitality, accommodation, lots of growth generative industries. We always think about sort of AI and life sciences, but you think of the employment growth, it's starting to become quite damaging. There was absolutely no movement on either of those two areas. There was perhaps a nod to absorbing all the recommendations of the Nuclear Regulatory Task Force, but realistically, that's going to be a decade away before that has any impact on the UK supply side.
Yeah. One of the other questions, actually, for both of you, is around the implementation of the measures announced in the budget and the timeline of that, because a lot of this isn't kicking in for at least a couple of years. In fact, some of the tax changes are very close to when the next general election should be, which defies all sort of electoral logic, and perhaps that's something, Kirsty, you can speak to. Simon, what do you make, though, first of all, of how this looks when we consider how these things will come in, when these things will come in, and therefore if we can make sense of it today, given we need some time for it to bake through?
That's your second terrific question of this podcast, because actually
much.
one of the
I'll take it.
one of the questions I've got most repeatedly in the last 48 hours from investors is, given how backloaded the tax increases are, and given how close that will come to the likely political cycle in the UK, I mean, it's not guaranteed there'll be a general election in 2029. I mean, there's many people far more skilled in this area than me that think it'll come in 2027. But let's assume it runs full term and goes to 2029. How realistic is that? I think the reason why it's such a good question is the bond market really hasn't backed up that skepticism in terms of its pricing. It hasn't said, well, this stuff is lacking credibility. If you look at how yields have responded, I think that runs to my, if you like, where I differ to consensus. A lot of people look at bond yields and go, well, that's doubts over the government's fiscal sustainability or its ability to service its debts. I don't think so, actually. I think the bond market is far more obsessed about inflation. And in reality, whether those tax increases come through in 28, 2029, those are not the big drivers of the inflationary stance of the UK. I think it was more encouraged, as I say, by some near-term, if you like, absence of those mistakes that were made by the Chancellor 12 months ago in terms of loading more costs on business.
And politically, look, on the face of it, politically, it makes no sense. So if you're trying to make sense of it from a political point of view, there's only, I think, possibly one potential explanation, because this is, you're right, very much a spend now, tax later budget. And I wonder whether that is because, in part because she's obviously more than doubled her fiscal headroom, that she believes that she can hold on to enough headroom that these at least some of these imposed and penciled in taxes she can remove and have a tax giveaway just before a budget, albeit probably not as much as she's ladled on, but everybody's waiting and spent 3 years waiting for it in this cloud of high taxation. And that if she can hold on to her fiscal headroom, she can use some of that as a giveaway, or she's banking on what, she spent the last 18 months crossing her fingers and banking on, rather than actually putting in the right policies to deliver on it, is growth. And that actually growth will allow her, give yourself enough time that hopefully things will turn around. Now, given the fact that the OBR has downgraded growth for every year of the rest of this parliament, that's a big kind of gamble. But politically, I can't see what other sense there is to it, except kind of pain deferred and the hope that things will turn around. But the other thing, Simon, I just wanted to raise with you is the other thing the OBR kind of flagged was that, where was growth in this budget? This is a government that bet the farm on trust, which I think it's fair to say has all but eroded, looking at the polls, but also on growth. And growth was kind of hardly mentioned in this budget, and it certainly, is kind of not, the OBR has said, in essence, there's nothing in this budget that will overly kind of impact one way or another on growth. Is that
Yeah,
right?
I mean, let's not. The OBR are not very good at forecasting growth, if we're honest.
Thank God we don't bank our fiscal rules around the OBR's forecast. Oh, wait.
There were some moving parts to the growth forecast. There was a downgrade because of the underlying driver of productivity, so output per hour being hit. But actually, hidden within the numbers, I don't think it's been picked up nearly enough, was actually an upgrade in participation. I mean, it's been written up as, more income tax receipts, a more rich employment mix. Actually, what has happened is inactivity, which we've spoken about a lot, I think, since the pandemic. They've actually, the data, at least from the ONS, which always comes with about 17 asterisk, is started to pick up. Working age inactivity is starting to fall, participation starting to rise, and that to some extent bailed out the sort of downgrade of growth. The other point on the if we're taking the OBR at face value, is they're still above consensus, although they slashed their growth forecast 1.5%. I mean, I was looking at the sort of Treasury independent, they collect from all city economists and independent economists their estimates for growth for next year. Consensus is 1.1%. The OBR is at 1.5%. So actually, the OBR is still more bullish than consensus. I think the idea of growth bailing them out, which realistically to engineer these U-turns probably means something close to a 2 in terms of growth at the sort of back end of this parliament. Some of those things on the cost of employment, the cost of energy, some rather more dramatic supply side moves are going to be required from this government if it wants to generate those levels of growth, or an exogenous event entirely beyond their control. And one could look at events going on in Geneva and Kyiv and Moscow at the moment in terms of the Ukraine war, in terms of potentially driving down gas prices, energy prices, agnostic of the sort of policy environment. But, you don't make economic policy, and you certainly don't make a political strategy based on something you are entirely out of your control.
Sure. And ironically, the flip side of that, is that it's just as likely that you might have another black swan event, which would have a more damaging effect and therefore eat away at that headroom. And again, we'd have a world where we're still in a doom loop, where we still have to come back maybe next year, maybe the year after, for more taxes to try and build that up again. At least on supply side, we have had some good news today and some common sense, in as much as we hear from the government that they're now not going to have this day one employment right, which presumably must be a sigh of relief from businesses up and down the country.
That's on unfair dismissal. Some of the other day one stuff, time of speaking, does still apply on leave and sick leave and all that.
Yes, but at the risk of sort of recasting the benchmark, bear in mind the OBR did not score the employee rights package in the most recent EFO, and therefore actually what you're doing is you're only just reducing the eventual hit when they score the whole package. Unless they repeal the whole package, we're not actually back at the position that was published just 2 days ago in terms of the EFO and the budget. So you're taking away some of the downside risk that was inherent in the EFO based on the thing that they didn't even evaluate.
Yeah, and the estimated cost at the moment was about 5 billion?
5 billion. 5 billion, yeah.
So before you've even started, we've already discovered there's a sort of £6 billion hole, which is not one for you to talk about, but obviously around education budgets and second. And then there's this, other unexploded bomb in the middle of this, which is somewhere in the region of 5 billion.
Yeah. So this is why, actually, if you took in a really crude way, you took the 6 and that 5, you got to 11, and if we stayed with the same amount of headroom of 10 billion, we'd already be mark to market talking about being underwater 48 hours after the budget. So this is why that 22 billion pounds of headroom is important for, if you like, just dialing down a little bit that level of speculation on, well, is you already going to have to come back in the spring or next autumn with more tax increases.
And on that note, Simon, thank you so much. It's really, really good to hear your brain out loud on the podcast. So thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Huge pleasure. Thank you.
Great to have Simon French on the pod. Kirsty, we started this podcast by you suggesting that this feels like a sort of classic Labour budget. You've talked about the welfare bill increasing by 70 odd billion quid. We've talked about the tax rises that we now know were a choice that Rachel Reeves made, that actually she was told that she would be able to meet her fiscal rules a few days before that odd press conference where she rolled the pitch for income tax rises before they then went away as well. So she definitely chose to raise the taxes that she's done. Is that what we mean by classic Labour? Is that the kind of definition?
Well, the definition, the classic definition of a Labour budget is tax and spend. So, we now have the highest level of taxes of any parliament in modern history. We also know that those with the broadest shoulders won't be paying the most on this. I mean, we have a kind of totemic sprinkle on the top of wealth taxes, which is the mansion tax, which is on the highest homes. But that only raises £400 million. If it raises that, we'll see, once the bureaucracy of that kicks in. But the vast bulk of this kind of raise is being met by middle income earners who are being, over the course of the next few years, through inflation, which remains sticky, and through higher wages, will be dragged into paying higher levels of tax. So the vast bulk of that tax bill, so 8 billion of that, is coming from freezing of the thresholds, and another almost 5 billion of it is coming from the salary sacrifice. So, for argument's sake, one of the ways you bring down your tax bill when you're in private sector employment is you have some of it offset into pensions or to travel to work season tickets, etc., etc. And she's also got a little mitts into that too. So that's where the vast bulk of these tax rises are coming from this year. It's basically people who work hard and get on to pay for, in part, a welfare bill that the government cannot get to grips with, and also in part, look, morally, it's perfectly fair to say children, it's not fair on children to be born into poverty because of a 2-child benefit cap, but you'll find plenty of people, which is reflected in all the polls, saying it is not fair to make me pay for the choices of people on low incomes to have children that they can't afford, because I didn't make that choice. And so why should I pay for the choices of others?
And the political point on that is made expertly, as usual, by Patrick Maguire, the Times chief political commentator today, who says in his column it was barely more than a year ago that 7 Labour MPs were actually suspended from the party, remember, for voting to abolish the 2-child benefit limit. Now the Prime Minister and Chancellor claim the same policy as their government's crowning glory. Before the election, Starmer was kind of committed to being so disciplined with public finances that he suspended these MPs, saying we can't afford it, it couldn't be done. And now this is suddenly his defining mission.
Oh, and one of the greatest critics of lifting the cap was Rachel Reeves herself.
Right.
We've moved from, like, before the election, we had do you remember when she was the Green Chancellor? Yes. Wanted to be remembered for being the most green Chancellor in the world? Well, we've removed green levies, and we've slapped some taxation on electric vehicle cars, which we'll wait and see what that does in terms of EV rollout. Then she was the Iron Chancellor, the Chancellor who's going to stick come hell or high water to her fiscal rules. Well, she's melted in the face of a bit of opposition from Labour backbenchers, in essence. And now we've got basically a soft left captured Chancellor, captured by her own backbenchers, captured by her own concerns to live and fight another day. And actually, we had a government that came in on trust, that came in on growth. This was not a budget for growth. The OBR says so. It self-evidently isn't so. You don't tax your way to growth, whether you do that on business in the budget last year or on working people in the budget this year. And just before the budget, she said her 3 guiding priorities for this budget was the NHS, which was virtually not mentioned at all in the budget, tackling the national debt, well, that will continue to rise, and improving on the cost of living. Well, we also see from the OBR figures that disposable incomes are going to be hit by this budget. So on any metric, on any measure, it's very hard for the vast majority of kind of hard-working Britons to not think that they're being penalised, A, to save her skin, and B, to appease the backbenchers who will not get to grips with the ballooning levels of welfare spending in this country.
Crucially, to add to that, how fickle are the backbenchers? So if they are satisfied now, will they be in a few months' time? Seems unlikely.
Well, the quote of the week belongs to Clive Lewis.
Oh, yeah, Labour MP.
Who was talking on Times Radio, and he was asked, is this enough to keep the backbench wolves from the door? And he said, well, look, if you're being chased by a pack of wolves and you throw a couple of pork chops over your shoulder, they will stop and eat them. But by implication, they'll stop and eat them, and then they'll look up and look for the next meal, right? Yeah. So it is pain deferred, not a complete escape for Rachel Reeves. And I think, unless anything else happens when we get to the local elections next year, where the results of this budget and the impact that has on working people and the result that has on the ballot box may leave Rachel Reeves and Starmer right back where they were, fighting for their own survival.
Kirsty, thank you so much, and thank you to multimillionaire billionaire Joe Tanner for beaming in from the south of France, and thank you as well, actually, to Simon French, whose expert analysis has helped us unpick this budget, which may do some more of its unpicking over the next few days as well. So we'll keep an eye on that for you. Do have a little scroll back. I think it's really interesting for you to have a listen to our budget preview episode from a couple of weeks ago to hear particularly the comments of Chris Curtis, Labour MP, who was sort of saying, there are loads of levers for growth. growth, and I'm sure the Chancellor will reach for them. Well, hang on a second. The OBR scores this budget as doing precisely nothing for growth. That was its assessment. It's really interesting to hear the preview from a couple of weeks ago and then match it with the reality of what we've actually got from the budget this week as well. So go and have a little listen to that. It's in your feed right now. And of course, you can hear what it's like behind the scenes in the House of Commons on Budget Day as well. So thank you for listening to this episode. Scroll back and listen to those two. And we will drop into your feed again next week with the freshest analysis taking you inside politics at Westminster. Press subscribe and we'll speak to you then.